Now let's go across to our guest who is joining us today, Harsh V. Pant, who is the Vice President, Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He's joining us. Thank you, sir, for speaking with WION.
Hello.
Sir, I want to begin by asking you, this is the first meeting between the defense ministers of India and China since the Galwan clash. Now, the fact that this meeting is even happening, what is the significance of that? And what do you think could be the key takeaways from this meeting?
See, I think the meeting is happening in the context of the SCO defense ministers meeting. So this has to be looked at in that context. It is not a bilateral, primarily a bilateral engagement, but the SCO platform is being used for the two sides to continue to have a conversation. Despite the Galwan crisis, India and China have not really given up on engaging with each other. There has been a continuous dialogue at the military level that has been happening. Several rounds of that has happened. In fact, one of the rounds had happened very, very recently. So I think that is part of the larger exercise that India is putting up to ensure that its interests are preserved, that the dialogue momentum continues. And this perhaps indicates that there is a seriousness on both sides to see to it that dialogue is maintained. But I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. How China responds to this engagement, whether the Chinese defense minister brings anything new to the table, that will shape the future of these dialogues. But I think India has taken the initiative using the SCO platform to initiate a direct defense ministers dialogue so as to ensure that the defense mechanisms that are available between the two nations are not completely in tatters. And I think it's an important moment which perhaps it would be useful for China to utilize if at all it is serious about its India relationship.
Right. Mr. Pant, you've been following this topic very closely ever since the Galwan clash happened. What are the signals from China so far? Is it still belligerent, or has it seen a reconciliatory approach? Or is it still aggressive in the signals that it has given? Because there have been 18 rounds of military talks so far.
I think we have had some successes in those 18 rounds where some parts of where we have disengaged in some parts of the disputed areas. But I think China continues to maintain a very, very aggressive stance in its dealings as far as Indian boundaries concerned. We have seen, for example, how they have renamed some of the areas in Arunachal recently. So I think what the Chinese are doing is they are signaling that while they are interested in negotiations, they will continue to push through their agenda when it comes to the boundary. And on the other hand, India is also indicating, while it sees no harm in engaging China, it is putting up a robust defense of its interests. It is putting up a robust defense of its military by its military on the border, and it wants to ensure that if at all a crisis is coming, then India is well prepared for it. So I think India's signals are as potent as Chinese signals, but it is up to China to decide how it wants to take its India relationship, because as the Indian foreign minister has said, that this is an abnormal time in India-China relationship. And unless Chinese make some decisions, it's very unlikely that abnormality is going to go away.
Okay, we'll talk about that abnormal relation in just a bit, but I want to bring your focus on the larger SCO meeting that's going to take place tomorrow, the SCO Defense Ministers meeting. What are your expectations from that meeting?
I think SCO for India is an important platform as it allows India to have a continuous engagement with a very important part of its periphery, the Central Asia. And we have seen how Central Asia and Central Asian nations, we have had a long historical relationship with them. But increasingly in today's context, we have seen the rise of extremism, terrorism emanating from that part of the world. And India has been very, very vocal about the need for regional countries to come together, to work together. And in the process of India's presidency of the SCO, we have seen India's emphasis on humanitarian and disaster relief, how, especially when it comes to the defense mechanisms, how certain kinds of practices and medicines can be engaged with across the region. So that we have seen in the last few months under India's presidency. And I think India is hoping that under its presidency, a robust mechanism a very clear-cut mechanism which allows India to talk with its neighboring countries in Central Asia on terrorism, on extremism is created, is taken forward, and is really strengthened, because that's where India feels some of the most important issues lie. And that's what India wants to take forward. So I think Defense Ministers' meeting is perhaps is going to be an important marker in that endeavor. It will bring these countries together to shape a regional mechanism on counterterrorism. Also, perhaps, I think something that you mentioned earlier on, India is going to emphasize the centrality of certain key principles like sovereignty and like territorial integrity. And I think that's where the China question becomes also interesting, because India is signaling that unless we respect some of these basic tenets of interstate relations, it's very difficult for SCO to live up to its expectations. And it's very difficult also to have bilateral mechanisms within the individual countries if those countries are not interested in respecting these basic principles.
Yes, indeed. Let's come back to that abnormal relation between India and China. That's what the foreign minister spoke about. I want to understand from you, sir, when there is an outstanding issue like the border issue between the two countries, how much does that hamper diplomacy in other sectors, other areas between the two countries?
New Delhi is making a point that it is now central to the way it looks at its diplomacy vis-a-vis China. In the past, India and China had come to terms with each other through a mechanism where the understanding was that let's keep talking about the boundary problem. Let's keep talking about the issue, which is very, very contentious and it will take time to resolve. So while we were talking about the boundary issue, the border problem, we were also continuing our engagement in other sectors, whether it was trade and investment, whether it was education, whether it was people to people and cultural ties. But now, after Galwan, India has taken a position that unless China goes back to the March 2020 positions, unless China restores the status quo ante on the border, it's very difficult to move forward, because there is a widespread trust deficit. If China is unilaterally changing their status quo on the border, then there is no point in having a dialogue mechanism with China where the outputs of those dialogue mechanisms are not respected. So I think we have seen a change in India's position. And that change is a very important and interesting change, because it makes it very clear to China what India's red lines are going to be when you talk of diplomacy in other sectors other than border. So I think India is putting the border question now front and center in its engagement with China. And it is the ball is frankly in China's court, how it wants to play that.
The ball is in China's court. Harsh Vipin, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective.